I've been painting now a little over 20 years, and I'm always looking for a way to challenge myself, but also I like to surprise people. And so I've done a number of different shows over the years, and it's been a few years since I've done a major solo show. This is the first one that I've done in about 3 years. And so I thought, okay, it's been about 20 years. I've done a lot of different things. I've changed my subject matter. I've gone from very realistic, impressionistic type of work to super abstract work to doing thematic shows like the one where I went out to the Big Sur area of California and did a whole series of paintings based on that. And so I thought, what could I do at this point in my career to sort of challenge myself and maybe shock people a little bit? And so for my show here in Dallas, I decided that, wow, what a great challenge it would be to take color out of the equation. And the reason for that is that color is what I breathe. Color is everything to me. Color is like swimming and breathing. It's effortless really. And so I thought, wouldn't it be a great challenge to take color out of the equation and then do an entire series of artwork completely in black and white and all of the shades of gray in between. And what that does is that instead of using color as the first thing that I tend to think about in a painting, I have to go back to the other principles of what make paintings powerful. Things like composition, paying attention to the power points within the canvas. I talk a lot about the 5 points, or the golden number, which has also been known as the golden section. Being aware of the placement of points of interest on those 5 points in the golden section, and then looking at value. The other thing that taking color out of the equation, it makes you really focus on value, black against white, and then all of the shades in between. And so instead of creating the paintings with color providing the nuances and the shading, it's completely being done with values. So that's really been fun. Really excited that I've been able to challenge myself and to present this show to you guys. So here we go. Absence of color. When I finally discovered painting just about 20 years ago, it was a revelation, because for the first time in my life, I was able to translate the color that I've innately felt since I was a child directly into the canvas. And I'll never forget the first time I painted. It was at the time I was still playing music. I was also working for CBS Radio, and I had the opportunity to sit in the studio with my then ex-wife, who was a gifted painter, and I'd sit with her playing my guitar and kind of watching and observing. And it was funny, the story goes that one night when she got kind of stuck, many times I'd be able to help her and say, well, why don't you try this color? And it would usually work. But then one night she turned to me and said, well, why don't you try it? And I said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, why don't you try painting? And I said, really? I could paint? And she said, yeah. And so I put my guitar aside and I said, well, what do I do? She said, well, just pick out a canvas and get some color. And thank God she was an oil painter. And she said, pick out the oils that you want to use. And so I did that, put a canvas on the wall, and I put the oils on my palette. And I will never forget, as long as I live, that moment. I dipped my brush into French ultramarine blue. And the first color that I ever put on canvas was that amazing glowing blue. And at that moment, I knew that that was what I had prepared for my entire life, that music and all these, being a potter and doing all these different things, were just really leading up to me finding my true voice, which was as an oil painter. And I tell people, it was literally that aha moment in my life where it was as if the clouds parted, the sun came out, the angels were singing and they were going, ah, and I knew at that moment that that was my destiny. That was why I was put on this planet. I pretty much dedicated myself from that moment on to this vision. I was still working at CBS Radio full-time as an account executive. I was still playing music. I had a band. I was in a couple of bands, so I had, creative projects that I was doing. But once I found oil, pretty much everything went by the wayside. And I literally painted 7 days a week. I would come home at night and have a little bite to eat, and I would immediately hit the studio. And those first 3 years, I painted on average about 50 paintings a month. And I was just on fire. I loved the Impressionists. I started studying them, and I started reading books, and I probably averaged about 20 books a month that I was reading to learn everything I could. And I just knew that if I was going to do this, and actually this was going to become my profession, that I had to dedicate every ounce, every atom of my being into making that a reality. And the thing is, I tell people, there is no substitution for practice. And I had someone tell me when I was playing music, a very gifted musician, and he said, JD, if you don't practice, you're kidding yourself. And I've never forgot that. So when I found oil painting, man, I practiced every day of the week. And I haven't looked back since. What I do, this 3D oil technique that I developed, can't really be duplicated with any other medium. You can do approximations of it, but there's a beautiful plasticity and viscosity that is unique to oil that I use extensively in the type of painting I do. And again, I'm just grateful that the universe gave me it right from the beginning, and I just decided to work with that. I'd like to talk a little bit about reflectionism and how this whole concept of this philosophy and this concept of art came about. It really goes back to when I was in music, and before I'd started painting, I was in a band with my musical partner, Chris Brickler, and we had a band with Persida Mate, the three of us, and it was called Reflection Theory. And really the idea came from the law of attraction. The law of attraction is basically the idea that as human beings, we are beings of energy. And whatever energy that we are focusing on, whatever energy we are holding in our minds, whatever energy we are speaking, goes out into the universe and is literally reflected back. And what I've experienced is that it's amplified. Whatever you're putting out comes back even stronger than you put it. We really try to focus on the higher vibrations of energy, love, joy, gratitude, things like that. This group of artists, myself, have basically decided to put as much positive energy out as human beings, and then we record what comes back in our art. And it can really be anything. I choose 3D oil as my medium, and many of the artists that I've mentored, painters, are using the 3D oil technique that I was fortunate to discover and develop. But it applies to anything. You can be a reflectionist if you're a glass blower, a dancer, a musician. I mean, we started it with music. So it's really more a philosophy of life that is reflected in our art. One of the cool things, I've thought about this too, one of my great influences has been Leonardo da Vinci, who in my opinion was the greatest genius of all time. And I say that because the breadth of his exploration, the breadth of his experience as an artist and all the things he did there's just nobody that I'm aware of that has done it to the extent that he did. And one of the things that he did was left these extensive journals, both with sketches. He was the first to do anatomy and literally dissect human bodies and do drawings of them. He designed war machines. He designed flying machines. I mean, all of these things, but they're all in his journals. And one of the things that have kind of confounded people over the years is that he actually wrote all of his journals in mirror reverse. So in other words, he would write in a way that if you looked at it, wouldn't make much sense, but you hold it up to a mirror and it's perfect. And so I've read debates about why did he do it? Was it to be secretive so that people wouldn't read it, wouldn't do this or that? And my belief is that Leonardo was the first reflectionist. He was aware of the law of attraction. It made him be aware that whatever he was putting out with intention was being reflected back like a mirror. So when you write in mirror reverse, every time you do it, it's a reminder that be cognizant, be aware of what you're focusing on, because guess what? It's coming back. And that's what I do. Like when I finish a painting and maybe have a great idea for a title, I write on the studio wall in mirror reverse for the same reason that I believe Leonardo did it, and that is simply to remind me that in that moment, whatever I'm thinking, whatever I'm putting out as energy as a human being is being reflected back. I was fortunate early on when I started painting. I realized that I needed to find a mentor, and so I put the idea out into the universe, and sure enough, a little bit time after that, someone told me about a woman named Liz Richardson, who had retired here in Dallas. She had studied at the Royal Academy of London, and he said that she was a master of Impressionism, and that if there's any way I could get her to convince her to take me on as an apprentice, that it would change my artistic life. So in fact, I did. I got her number. I called her. I'll never forget. She grilled me extensively as to why she should invest her time in me, and I convinced her that I would be worth her time because I felt like this was my calling and my destiny. So Liz agreed to let me come and study with her. And you know what? She, rather than actually sit down and paint with me, I literally spent a year every week, anywhere from 2 to 4 hours once a week, and sit and listen to Liz talk about the principles of art. The universal principles that for whatever reason exist and that are no accident, and there is no accident that certain artists and certain artworks wind up being in the museums and considered great works of art. And Liz had studied that her entire life. She was in her late 80s when I met her, and she'd spent her entire life studying this, and for that first year, she never painted with me. We talked about the principles. We talked about, she called her boy Cézanne. Cézanne was her master, the one that she looked to more than any other of the previous masters, and we'd study him and other ones. And after a year, Liz agreed to sit down with me and do my first private lesson. And I will never forget that day as long as I live. I sat down with her and sat in her studio, and she said, well, what would you like to learn? I'm like, I don't know, you tell me. But so I said, well, I had just been to Jamaica, and I'm trying to do Impressionism, and I happen to have some photographs with me. She said, well, give me the photographs, let's take a look at them. And she took those and she chose one, and in that first session, she sat down and she took one of my photographs and translated it into a palette knife work of oil. And it was a revelation. That night, I gained 50 years of learning experience in one day. And I went home that night, and I still have the painting. It was remarkable what seeing a true master opened up for me. And so I did that. I studied with Liz up until the time she died in her mid-90s, and then she wound up calling me her boy. Because of that experience, I learned firsthand what mentorship can mean. So the whole Reflectionist school is just that. It's my way of showing the things that I've learned from others and the things that I've discovered myself, and being a mentor for other talented and gifted artists. All of them have evolved their own evolution of it. They're all using their own type of techniques. My wife, Leah Fisher, who's in our gallery, she's one that, I showed her how to start, and she's completely done a different thing. Philip Romano, my business partner as well, but also a gifted artist, is using it. All these wonderful people who have actually wound up becoming professional artists and sell their work and consider themselves reflectionists. This year I will be 64 years old, which kind of blows my mind. I remember the Beatles writing "When I'm 64" and going, wow, that's old. But here I am. And you know what, I don't feel 64. Some days I do, but most of the time I just feel as the same way I did when I was 16. But this path has been a pretty marvelous experience. My artistic journey started when I was 4 years old, and it literally started with a vision. I had a waking dream that, and I'll just kind of tell you exactly what it is. I saw this it was like a cartoon. It was like being in a Disney cartoon, and there was a big hay wagon, and I was riding on the hay wagon. I was up front with the guy that's driving, and there was horse drawn. He was driving the horses, and the wagon was filled with all our friends and family and all the people that I was surrounded by. And it was a beautiful sunset, and the birds were singing, and the sun was golden and glowing. And I remember everybody was just singing, literally singing with joy. And from that moment, for whatever reason, that inspired me to try to take that joy that I experienced in that first vision as a young child and express that in art. And I have literally spent my entire life, the last 60 years, following that vision and doing my best to express that joy that I felt and share that with others. And it's been a somewhat circuitous road. I started young as a musician. I started playing when I was 10 years old. I played guitar, trumpet. When I was 16, I started playing nightclubs and was literally sneaking in underage and illegal, but I was playing in nightclubs, and I continued to follow it. And it wasn't till later that I discovered that my true voice was with painting. And I guess the point of that is that to be a professional artist or musician of any kind, you have to have absolute dedication. I mean, there were literally years, especially the years in music, when I was starving. I mean, we didn't have enough money for food, and I remember having to sell a guitar one time to be able to pay rent for myself and the conga player that I was traveling the country with, and buy enough food for us to live and get through the next few weeks. And everybody would say, well, man, why don't you quit and get a real job? And, why are you doing this? Why not, But I never, not ever did I consider quitting. And I continued through and eventually, through a lot of different jobs and a lot of different ventures, eventually found oil painting and found what was my true voice and my destiny. But it never would have happened if I had quit when the going got tough. And if you look at every artist just about who's ever lived that became something, became a master in whatever they were doing, they had to have that kind of dedication and not give up no matter what. And one of the things that I realized when I finally discovered oil painting, this was late in my life. I was 43 years old when I finally found my true avocation. I realized something. When I was younger, when I was studying music, I would literally, that was in high school, I was living in the hills of Pennsylvania, and I had a motorcycle, and I would strap my guitar onto the back, and I'd ride up way as far as I could get into the woods, up the top of the mountain, and then I'd, away from everything, and I'd stop, and when I'd stop, there was just this beautiful silence, and all I could hear was the wind and the birds and everything, and I literally learned to play guitar. I studied some, but I learned in those trips out into nature, listening to nature and translating what was around me into music. And in my youthful arrogance, I thought, well, I better not study too hard other musicians, because I felt like if I did, that it would somehow dilute my personal vision, which I thought was so important. And I think that it held me back from being as good a musician as I could have been. And I didn't realize that till many years later. So when I discovered oil painting, I decided this time I'm going to stand on the giants who have come before me. I decided to learn everything I could about every aspect of art that had come before me. And that meant looking at the masters, studying the masters, and just some of the ones that I was really influenced with. I started with a love of the Impressionists, and I studied Monet and Renoir and Pissarro, later Cezanne, and after that led to my studies of Van Gogh, who was a contemporary of the Impressionists, but he and Cezanne both started doing things that were taking this new vision that they had and even further, developing them further. So I learned from them, from Van Gogh, I learned just color, using pure and sculptural color. He was really the first to put oil on the canvas really thick. The Impressionists were putting it on thicker than had been done before, but Van Gogh was the first to really put it almost sculpturally. And so I learned how to do that from him and be very expressionistic. And then from Cezanne, I learned about different ways of expressing things like distance. And he was the first one that in his landscapes, instead of using aerial perspective, which up till that time was the way that you denoted distance in a painting, and basically what that is that as you look farther away, there's more oxygen between you. So that's why when you look at a mountain that's far away, it tends to go more gray and the colors aren't as pure. But Cezanne was the first one to basically stop doing that. He painted every layer, no matter how far away, in pure color, but the way he created the illusion of depth was by superimposing these geometric shapes on top of each other. And he was the one that first reduced nature to the cone, the rectangle, and the circle. And so he created a new entire way of creating the illusion of depth, but without aerial perspective or without diluting color. So I learned that from him. And then after that, really, I would have to say the next major influence was Picasso, Pablo Ruiz Picasso. Still probably the most singular, impactful artist as far as the influence and maybe modeling some of the things in my life. But what I loved about Picasso was that he never stopped changing, never stopped trying to push himself and to do something new. And then later, of course, the contemporary of his, Matisse. Matisse was a master, one of the master colorists of all time. I learned a lot by studying him. And then later, really, as a child, I loved cartoons. And so I remember the vivid colors of Walt Disney and Walter Lantz. And so I grew up in that generation in the 50s where they were the first color cartoons to be, put in movie theaters. And so I was also influenced by their use of color and their way of graphically describing the world around them. And it's been I've been fortunate to study all these different masters. There are many others, I mean, that I could talk about, but those are the major ones. And instead of being arrogant like I was when I was younger, I've tried to be more humble and really realize that all of these great artists that have come before me have done something to contribute to the evolution of art. And so I am just doing my best to reflect what I've learned from them and contribute in my way, no matter how small it may be, to that evolution of art. And I've done that, and I'm doing that with my three-dimensional oil techniques that I discovered and invented, and also the idea of reflectionism and the law of attraction. So that's why I'm here. I'm here for my own personal journey, but I'm also here to maybe bring a little bit of light to the people and the world that I'm surrounded by, and I'm just I ultimately feel gratitude and joy and just a real sense of, wow, this universe is amazing, and I'm glad to be part of it. So glad to be here, and look forward to doing it for another 60 years, maybe.